Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hello and welcome back to Neophytes of Narratology, our first video episode. I'm Jonathan E. Manzer, here with Scott Thurlow.
Live and in person.
And Stephen Hermosi.
Here we are.
All right, and today we are doing, for our arbitrary comedy month in April, we're doing stand-up comedy as social and cultural mediation by Lawrence E. Mintz of the University of Maryland. And we found this on JSTOR, so we're going to have a link there, but they have the charges and all that.
Etc. Proper academic channels.
Yeah.
So we'll go into, basically, I think it starts off with a brief history of comedy.
Yes.
And well, actually, it's incredibly brief. It's kind of just doing the gloss over of the history of how both comedy and particularly stand-up comedy throughout the ages and American comedy. I believe this was written in 1987,
85,
or something
close
in the 80s.
Yeah.
So stand-up comedy and comedy clubs were becoming a huge hit at that point.
Right.
So it's kind of a reflection.
They were growing in
on
popularity.
the history of stand-up and all that. But then it starts to go into an in-depth analysis of how comedy is a reflection of our culture.
Well, if I may just read one line from the introduction, that I think it basically is his whole core point. This paper will argue that humor is a vitally important social and cultural phenomenon, and then he goes on to point out how and why, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say that some of the points in this work I kind of understood already, but he brings up some very unique views of
or at least,
stand-up.
Not often explored avenues.
Yeah, and in comparing it to other cultural phenomena, especially historically. I mean, we're doing a Joseph Campbell overview of Hero with a Thousand Faces,
Right.
And it kind of felt like a version of that with
maybe only because we've been reading that, but I see what you mean.
But I think there is a comparison to be made there. But anyway, we'll go in depth, which he starts off with the power of stand-up, and it's to judge what social norms should be.
Mm-hmm.
And he really goes into some fascinating things, which I want to start off with a quote, which is from Victor Turner, who I was really inspired to read some of
I'm going to check out some of his stuff, yeah.
Which is the experience of public joking, shared laughter, and celebration of agreement on what deserves ridicule and affirmation, fosters community and furthers a sense of mutual support for common belief and behavior, hence right. And that is a right in the sense of going through kind of a cultural right, whether you're dealing with jesters in the Middle Ages or shamans in the prehistory, of kind of developing mutual acknowledgement of what social norms should be. You guys have any comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right about that. This paper in general kind of just talks about the idea of behind stand-up comedy being, allowing the stand-up comedian to talk about things that aren't socially acceptable,
or
things like that,
taboo even at some point.
And I think it makes a lot of good points in terms of that. There are definitely some examples that'll come later that show kind of how that worked. I feel like this guy Lawrence Mintz loved Rodney Dangerfield. He mentions him several
Dangerfield
times.
was big in the 80s.
Yeah,
but...
I mean that's kind of the point though. He talks about all these older comics. There's a whole new range of stand-up comics now that could be, kind of substituted in for the people that he talks about. But
absolutely,
yeah. But there are, the most of the comics that he talks about are kind of, I don't want to say completely timeless, but like a lot of them are people that you would recognize now. Rodney Dangerfield being one of the main ones, but
an early mentioned one with a joke of its own, which I thought was pretty good. But sure. No, I don't want to add to that part. I think what I want to delve into, well, I think you'll come to shortly. So continue on.
I do have one last point here, which is where he talks about the relationship between the stand-up comedian and the audience as plural reflexivity. And in a way, it is again, it's going back to that idea that the stand-up comedian is allowed to bring up taboo subjects, but it's only allowed in the way that the audience is willing,
insofar
to,
as that,
to reach, like, as far as they'll be willing to travel with the stand-up comedian, and there is that kind of mutual give and take there. But next,
I do have one quick thing. I'm sorry. I do like this thing, and we've discussed this sort of thing on various Neophytes episodes and beyond. That he's citing a work from Mary Douglas, who's an anthropologist, and that where he notes that she emphasizes that the contents and processes of joke telling are at least as important as the texts of the joke themselves to any true understanding of the meaning of humor. And I'm a big fan of contextual things and like sort of considering those factors in general. So I enjoyed the fact that he pointed that out or cited another work which he is going to use to sort of explore that more.
So he then goes into the actor of the stand-up comedian and how it's almost required that a stand-up comedian be the pitied outcast, even if generally you find, and like I didn't really. It's obvious now that I read.
You can see that in so much stand-up comedy.
But whether you're dealing with Rodney Dangerfield, with like the down on luck guy, Louis C.K., who's a very modern comedian. He's the poor schmo who's always down on his luck. Or Seinfeld was always about that. But is someone who's allowed to have the role of the social critic because they lower themselves below anyone else. Right. There's a quote I heard, I don't remember who to attribute it to, but about how comedy only works when you punch up. You can never punch down in comedy because that's not humor there. And in a way, that's this comedian lowering himself so he can punch up at any part of society. And I thought it was very well put.
Yeah, there's actually, if I may for just a second, there's a quote that I heard recently by Don Rickles, because he just died.
Who was also mentioned in this article
he is
way before
quickly,
when he was still alive.
But he says something similar where it's like it takes, you need to be a big person to laugh at yourself. He's talking to his audience because Don Rickles was famously known for just throwing out jabs at everybody and making fun of everyone. And he says you need to be a big person to take that and laugh at it, or you can only make jokes about people that are bigger than you, I think is what he says. And he was like, and you. This was like one of his closing lines. Is like you've all been very big people tonight, or something like that.
Sure. Now I just want to do one more thing. I think this quick little passage exemplifies what you just said as a sort of the comedian's role. He is both a negative, these are the academic terms, negative exemplar for when we laugh at him, when he fills that role, but then he becomes our comic spokesman when he sort of points out and says the things about society that perhaps we think but are reluctant to say ourselves.
There's another quote I'd like to throw out that follows right from that. The oldest, most basic role of the comedian is precisely this role of negative exemplar. The grotesque, the buffoon, the fool, the simpleton, the scoundrel, the drunkard, the liar, the coward, the effete, the tightwad, the boor, the egoist, the cuckold, the shrew, the weakling, the neurotic, and other such reifications of socially unacceptable traits are enacted by the comedian to be ridiculed, laughed at, repudiated, and finally symbolically punished.
Yeah.
But there is another aspect that I believe he brings up, which is you occasionally have comics who will go in the sense the other direction and play like the ladies' man or the cocksure individual, and we laugh at socially unacceptable traits, not just like the negatives, but like the person who overreaches and gets punished for overreaching.
Right. They're still, exactly. I would say they're still viewed as like this socially unacceptable or this person who, the audience says, I couldn't get away with that, but I'm happy to listen to someone who can like pull that off. I think they mentioned Red Fox is like one of them, a comedian that did that type of humor.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, like, it's so obvious now. One of my favorite comedians for specifically around like the early 2000s was Louis Black, who didn't play the role of like the buffoon, but played the role of the person who could get angrier,
sort of the outraged guy on his
what was
chair.
allowed in normally socially acceptable, and became the voice piece. I actually saw him somewhat recently, and it's funny because it was during Obama administration.
Funny.
No, it actually particularly it was funny, but it wasn't as funny as he was when he's being angry. Because he was talking about like vacations he took and like unfortunate events that happened there, and he didn't have the rage to make him identifiable. And it sort of felt that he hadn't lowered himself, but that wasn't his style to lower himself. His style was to be the angry mouthpiece. When he was nothing to be angry about, there was no humor there.
Right.
So it was an interesting little take on that. Anyway, the next section is living vicariously through the outcast.
Yeah.
In which they talk about how the
Which
audience...
is what I do, of course.
Yeah. The audience gets to pretend to be Louis Black and who's yelling everything they want to yell. They get to be Red Fox, who's talking about oral sex in a public space, and they'd never given
at a time in which it was more taboo than it was today.
Actually, I want to mention something quickly about that Red Fox section because he talked about the two different kinds of reaction that Red Fox got when he went to go see him. And I think it's kind of funny, like, you know, you have the older crowd who kind of like shies away, but it still finds it funny, but they kind of lean back and look at other people around them to make sure that, you know, it's still okay. This is still just a comedian and it's just a joke, right? And then there's the younger crowd who would like cheer him on and go, yeah, like this is kind of what we kind of want to do away with these old social mores, I guess, and like we want to be able to talk about this stuff. And Red Fox was providing a platform for that.
Covering both fronts
to some
people,
extent.
which is something goes back to what Ian sort of said originally, where like the audience role and like the effect that the comedian's going for upon that audience and what they, depending on who they are, get out of it.
And I think that if you've ever seen a joke bomb for being overly offensive or they went too far along the frontier that they stepped into socially unacceptable territory.
Right.
That's always been I like stand-up comedy quite a bit, and I've seen a number of artists in person. But it's a very interesting like phenomena to see.
Sure.
Because it's especially in our day and age. I think it's rare, but it can happen.
Absolutely. And you know, jokes can bomb for any number of reasons, but that's definitely an interesting thing to see. And if you ever want to see that happen, just go to any open mic night.
Well, that's
like that definitely happens more there, I would say, than anywhere else.
Of course, because I want to tie something that you pointed out on our Syntax Era comedy game, Steve, was that by and large, people are just en masse not that funny. Right. So like when they try to cross like to be edgy and like cross some kind of social taboo, when it's no longer like a joke, it's just unacceptable and not funny at that point.
See, I actually want to bring up a couple examples when we're towards the end. But here's a quote, and we begin with Freud. If, as Freud posited, there's a battle going on between our instincts and our socially developed rules of behavior, comedy provides an opportunity for a staged antagonism.
Yeah, I have the exact one. Well, of course, every time anything now mentions Freud, I point it out. But yeah, I thought that was still like a solid phrase or like thing to encapsulate there. But I, of course, made my own joke. My side note is that Freud would have been great as a stand-up comedian.
I mean, he started the Yo Mama jokes.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
sure. So anyway.
And so I actually was talking to Ian a little bit earlier about how I thought this kind of was going into how comedy is making counterculture okay, or stand-up comedy is making counterculture okay, and I think that's a large portion of what this is talking about. It does have, shortly after the quote that you just read, it does have a section that talks about the normal comics, I guess, or people that kind of try to stay mainstream and don't try to live on the fringes. And I can just read that right now quickly. But it says, while some critics of popular entertainment try to distinguish between a traditional stand-up comedy characterized by an irrelevant quest for laughs and a so-called new wave comedy, which is more socially and politically satiric or insightful, such categorization belies the consistent role of stand-up comedy as social and cultural analysis. And
yeah, that's a good quote.
You can really see things like that where if you look at like old school comics like Bob Hope, he was kind of socially acceptable. If you wanted to go see somebody talk about things that you weren't supposed to talk about, you'd go see somebody else. Excuse me, somebody else like Red Fox or whatever. But I think that's an interesting
sort of division.
Dynamic between those two, because even the ones that are within the mainstream, I think, still say those things that people want to, like, that the people in the mainstream want to say, but feel that they can't.
I actually have a kind of, I agree with you completely on that. So I want to build off of that. So there's an element of common ground here,
right?
Which is and this is what kind of the next section is about a little bit, which I entitled Vox Populi and Vox Vulgaris.
Yeah.
Which is the stand-up comedian having to, you go, especially with comedy clubs, you go up to your audience, you directly interact with them, and you start telling how much of a schlub you are in order to get people to at least accept you as their voice.
To buy into that, yeah,
and
sure.
Going back quickly to our discussion over why certain comics can bomb, is I think it might also deal, particularly, not going too far, but not developing their
rapport with the audience.
Yes, or their ability to be the voice of them. So
that's very, very well pointed out.
What's interesting about the common ground is that I'm going to look at George Carlin for a second, who's one of the greatest comedians of all time. And who I had the fortune of...
I think we all agree on that, at least.
I was fortunate enough to see him, too.
Oh, nice.
He has that bit about, like, vulgar words you can't say on, like, in
TV
and all that. Yeah. That would be considered pretty uncontroversial nowadays. Although at the time it was
but because of him.
And that's exactly the point. When you establish, in a sense, if you are on the frontier 50 years ago, you are in the mainstream now.
Right,
because if the common ground has moved past
forward.
You.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
So
I agree, at least.
While I'm saying that, I'm not saying that Bob Hope was at all a controversial figure. I'm saying that
it's less controversial.
If you look at like the traditional joke about like airline food being terrible, that's in a sense it's still complaining about common culture.
Yeah,
right. And it's been done so much now that it's so cemented in the common ground. That's not funny anymore unless you put a unique spin on it. But the thing is that, Bob Hope was a voice. He was not anywhere near where George Carlin or Red Fox or Anthony Jeselnik or whoever you want, Louis C.K. now are. But, he had his role at that point and being that popular voice.
He did. I mean, he was like the Jimmy Fallon of his time, basically. If you want to find somebody who's like similar now, is, Jimmy Fallon is just kind of he tells jokes. They're funny. I think he's funny, but he doesn't ever really step over the line.
He's not really pushing any boundaries per se. Sure.
But but he's not playing a role that's intended to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he does the self-deprecation quite a bit. He makes fun of himself quite a bit.
Yep.
But he's lighthearted.
I think it's more general. You're right. Like I think if I could rephrase what we're all trying to sort of getting at right now is that if you're sort of fit into a certain, I don't want to say stereotype per se, like a certain style in general of comedy, then if you try to break out of that, it seems odd, and your audience may lose their connection with you because it's not what they've been comfortable with, but known to expect.
If you're in a culture war, not everyone is supposed to be on the front lines.
Yeah, exactly. You could be on the fringes, or you could just be, in the rank and file.
Someone's cooking the meal at home. So,
exactly.
And I think that's a very interesting point, and should give you kind of pause before people critique a certain comedian for not being edgy enough.
Mhm.
Like, not everyone's going to be George Carlin. Not everyone's going to be Jon Stewart in the political ring.
Right.
You're going to have like people doing their different roles.
And if everyone tried to be, then there would there'd be nowhere to tell. Like,
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. There's room. I think there's definitely room for both. And anybody who's not doing super edgy stuff, it's not like their comedy is bad.
Yeah, it's not like any
Because
worse
of
or
that.
better or something. Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's a different style. However, I would say they still are given more room to expose kind of the hypocrisies of the world or things like that than perhaps you would be if you were talking to your boss or something like that. You know, like there's stand-up comedy is this whole different realm of discussion about the politics of society than anywhere else, I think. And I think that's something that he's really trying to say in this article.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So I basically talked about everything I wanted to talk to about this. You guys have any points?
No, I mean, they covered a lot of it. Like, I do agree, though, that what I found interesting is pointing out, like, sort of the evolution of the comics' role and their sort of position within society to comment about it and what, the I guess, the LCD, for lack of a better term, like, what their general status quo is, and to perhaps question that status quo and force people to maybe look at it in a different light or voice perhaps opinions that people within that have but are reluctant to, like I said, voice generally socially themselves.
Yeah, exactly. That last part, I think, is a lot of what's involved here, and I think that's absolutely right. It's kind of the idea that this, whatever comic you go to see, people really like this comic. They're giving voice to half-formed ideas that the audience has had, or things that they've been afraid to say a lot of times, and I think that's kind of the power of comedians. And sometimes they're given too much rope, I would say. But it's tough to say because this is.
But who is the arbiter of how much rope they should get?
This is the outlet of people that want to of completely natural instincts of people to talk about certain things, and they're not allowed to. So comedians just kind of take it to the utmost extreme of that. And it becomes kind of ridiculously funny, like foolishly funny, as
or at least can in certain circumstances, for sure.
I did want to mention one other quote in here, talking about the idea that comedians get to talk about things that normal people wouldn't actually usually. And he says the styles of stand-up comedy differ almost as much as the content of jokes, joke routines themselves, but the essence of the art is creative distortion. And the idea there is kind of that you take something kind of at the basis of the art of comedy, I think, is taking something and flipping it on its head, looking at it and being and forcing people to look at it in a completely different light than they normally would.
I think that's a core of it as well.
Any any comedy, whether it's edgy or not, it's still making people look at things in a different way and kind of juxtaposing them with things that are ridiculous, and that's why it's funny,
Sure.
I don't know if I have too much more to say.
No, I mean, that's pretty much it. And
beyond that,
I think the paper ends with sort of itself an admittance of like more research is sort of necessary, but at least we have this sort of core to go on from.
They actually bookend it kind of because in the beginning it's talking about how studies of humor are generally not taken seriously.
Well, like they're apologetic for studying like a unserious subject.
And I'm interested to see, because I'm not ever saying that comedy was ever light, but I think that in our modern day and age, when comedians tend to give the news to the youngest generation,
or it's becoming somewhat of a phenomenon for a while now.
Yeah.
If comedy has more prestige nowadays, or at least begrudging like prestige given by academics because of their influence.
That's an interesting point.
We might have to explore that in a further episode, but I think it definitely merits.
If you look at probably the person that gave the most news as a comedian in our lifetime, Jon Stewart himself often said, even though people watched his show to get the news, basically, a lot of people found him more topical and truthful, I guess,
trustworthy, than the actual news outlets.
than Fox News or
Yes.
any other, CNBC or whatever. But he always said, "Look, I'm not a newscaster. My job, first and foremost, is to make people laugh, and because I'm doing
The
it
fact
with
that news does it for me.
because I'm doing it with current events does not change that fact."
But it also goes to this point where he would naturally say that because given if he was labeled a journalist, he would not have the ability to punch up
Right.
the way he does. If he just says, "Look, I'm just a comedian. I don't like. I'm a fool. I'm a buffoon." He would lose his power in a way. It's interesting.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that is an interesting thing about it, but I think it's absolutely true, and you can sort of see that, like, as an example that from him.
Absolutely.
So that's pretty shit. It's quite a good article. I would say check it out. Put a link to the official channels for it. But yeah, it was quite well done, and I enjoyed it. And I think, again, sort of an underexplored thing, and for our, like you said, arbitrary comedy month, it was a good pick.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Jonathan E. Menzer, here with Steven Ramosi.
Have a good night.
Scott Thurlow.
And I'll be here all week. Try to steak. Good night.
Have a good night.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.